Okay, hello everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Can we all hear me okay? G'day, Jace. How are you? Someone let me know if my mic is working and you can all hear me. G'day, Borgie. Wonderful. Thanks, Daz. Awesome. Okay, so Chris should be on in, there we go. Perfect timing. Okay, he's just connecting. Awesome. Thank you everyone for joining us again for our second episode, hopefully, or second topic session. Hopefully most of you guys caught the first one. If you didn't catch the first one, sending a recording from the first one to everyone after this session. G'day, Chris. How are you?
I'm doing well, thanks, Jake. Can everybody hear me as well?
I certainly can. So I'm assuming everyone else can. Yep. Good. Wonderful.
Great
How are you
stuff.
feeling tonight? You feeling a bit better than last week?
I am surviving now much better than last time. Yes, thank you. I've eaten a few meals and I'm definitely lost a bit of weight, but I'm fully functioning.
Someone asked you for a physique update last week, so that's your physique update this week. You were several kilos lighter post
A
food
lot
poisoning.
thinner, yes. A lot thinner.
So just while we give people a couple minutes longer to log on, we might just recap a little bit of what we covered last week, as it is going to tie in really heavily today. So obviously today's topic, we are talking frequency and sort of how we look at volume throughout the course of the week. And it really needs the foundations we set last week. So we might just spend a couple minutes recapping and then we'll jump into some new material for you all.
Absolutely. Do you happen to have that workout stimulus slide that we used last time? I think you might have. Fantastic. So this was the slide that we talked about a lot last time. Basically, what it tries to do is give us a way of quantifying the stimulus for a muscle from a given number of sets. Everything is expressed relative to the first set. So you can see that if you do a single set, that is defined as being one unit, one arbitrary unit of hypertrophy stimulus. A lot of people will naturally assume that if you do two sets, you will get 2 units, 2 arbitrary units of hypertrophy stimulus. That's not true. Basically, you get something around 1.39 for those 2 sets. So your second set is like 39% as good as your first set. So that then continues up, and you can see that really we're starting to max out around about 2 arbitrary units at around about the 7, 8, 9 sets in a workout for a muscle group. And that's probably where we can't really exceed that before muscle damage starts to pull away from the muscle protein synthesis that we are generating in order to produce hypertrophy. So this was the essence of what we talked about last time, just for people who are still arriving. Just recapping what we talked about last time. It's the idea that every workout that we do, we have diminishing returns of subsequent sets in a workout. Just again, I'm throwing this on Jake now, but do we happen to have the recovery slide as well, the one where we had the kind of the muscle damage? Fantastic. So what this does is it says, well, if we're talking about the number of, or talking about the amount of stimulus from each set in a workout, and we see that that relationship is very non-linear, what does the relationship between muscle damage, post-workout muscle damage, and the number of sets in the workout look like? What's the recovery period, in other words? And this is essentially just a whole load of different studies, all in trained people, all in trained lifters, showing that there's an approximately linear relationship between the number of sets you do in the workout and the number of days it then takes to recover from that workout. So essentially what we're dealing with here is a very, very big mismatch between the stimulus relationship to volume and the fatigue, post-workout fatigue relationship to volume. If we look at stimulus, we're getting a diminishing return effect. So later sets are less effective. If we look at fatigue, it's broadly linear. So the more sets we do, the more fatigue we're going to experience post-workout. So this mismatch is really the underpinnings of what we're going to be talking about today when we talk about how frequency works. Because as you can probably predict, you know, we're not going to be recommending that everybody does like a bro split arrangement where you do a whole load of sets and then basically kind of wait a week and then train the muscle again. That's really not going to work because of this discrepancy between the diminishing returns of the stimulus and the linear relationship of fatigue. So just to clarify, people are asking questions in the comments. So just to clarify, all of these studies are talking about sort of single muscle groups, and generally speaking, we're dealing with one exercise for that muscle group, and all we're modifying is the number of sets. So people are doing maybe 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 sets for a muscle group with an exercise, and then we're just tracking how long it takes to recover from that particular workout, and that gives us a number of days, and then we can give a kind of a comparison between studies, and that's what this relationship is then looking at. So basically, yeah, that's a very quick summary of what we did last time, but we're kind of chewing into the time now. So I'm going to hand back to Jake and ask him to do the intro, and then we'll kick off with the frequency webinar, I think.
And just quickly off the back of that, so you mentioned that this is obviously talking about volume per muscle group. When you talk about the hypertrophy stimulus, that's also the same case. There's a few people confused about that last time. So that graph with the sets per set, that's for the same muscle. So cool, we've got a few people online, so we'll jump into today's topic. So like you said, we're talking about frequency. There was a few people asking where to get the first seminar, so we will email that over afterwards, so make sure you guys check that out. But obviously today's topic, we're keeping the context of pre-steroid era bodybuilders. So what we want to do is we still want to look back in time, and we want to look at what kind of programs were working best before things got muddied, the waters got muddied with the introduction of anabolics. And as we discussed last time, that's arguably sometime in the mid to late 50s, potentially 1954. That seems to be the best evidence we have, but sometime in that mid to late 50s is when anabolics really started to infiltrate bodybuilding. So we're going to look at a lot of examples today, actually a few more examples than what we looked at last week. And those examples, I'm trying to obviously get those all from before 1954, so we can start to get a good understanding of how people were training and obviously achieving the highest degree of hypertrophy stimulus possible before the introduction of anabolics. So that is the focus of today. And we're going to start, let me pull up our first slide. We are going to begin with maintenance volume, correct, Chris?
Yes, let's look at maintenance. Fantastic. Okay, so this is the starting point for today. Basically, this slide is addressing a very, very simple concept, which is very, very widely misunderstood in the fitness industry at the moment. There is this perception that, for example, let me kind of sort of set the scene by quoting the kind of question that I see all the time. The kind of question I see all the time on social media, someone will say to me, is 1 set or 2 sets or 3 sets per workout enough to stimulate hypertrophy? That's verbatim the kind of question that I receive on a kind of semi-regular basis. The reason people are asking that question is because they think that there is a need for a certain amount of volume to stimulate muscle growth that then is still present at the next workout. And they think perhaps that a slightly lower level of volume might be what you might call a maintenance volume. In other words, there's like different amounts of volume will cause us to, kind of basically experience either maintenance, as in you tell the muscle to stay the same size, or hypertrophy, as in you tell the muscle to grow. So these are the concepts that I think people are working with. It's like this level of volume tells your muscle to stay the same size. This level of volume tells your muscle to grow, and maybe a really tiny amount of volume doesn't even do that. Now, the problem is that all amounts of volume tell your muscle fibers to grow as long as they've been activated and loaded mechanically. The issue is not that hypertrophy doesn't happen, it's that the amount of hypertrophy is not enough such that it lasts until your next workout. So basically what this slide is showing us is that when we go through a stimulus period, we do a workout where we go into a stimulus period, we create hypertrophy of the muscle fibers that have just have been stimulated. And then in the following days, when we've left that stimulus period, which is usually regarded as being approximately 48 hours. And we can argue the exact duration at another date, but it's probably not a good idea to do that on this call because there's not enough time. Basically, assuming it's around about 48 hours, then what happens is we experience a growth period in that 48-hour window. Now, if it's a big stimulus, sure, you'll get a large amount of growth. If it's a small stimulus, get a small amount of growth. Once you leave that stimulus period, there is nothing you can do apart from another workout, obviously, but there is nothing you can do to stop that hypertrophy from then starting to dissipate. So if we just look at the chart for a moment, what you can see there is that in the stimulus period, we've created some hypertrophy. And basically the area under the blue line, the blue curve, is the extra muscle growth that we've then generated. In the subsequent atrophy period, we're then removing that muscle growth. So this happens irrespective of whether we've done a very low volume workout, really tiny volume workout, in fact, a moderate volume workout or a high volume workout. The only difference is the amount of hypertrophy stimulus that you've generated. As soon as you enter the atrophy period, you are then losing that muscle growth that you have previously gained. This is so important to understand, and this is basic physiology. But generally speaking, the internet kind of hive mind tends to assume that it works differently. All levels of volume stimulate hypertrophy. The question is just the magnitude. And then the subsequent atrophy period is obviously then going to chew away at whatever hypertrophy you have stimulated. If you stimulate a very small amount, then obviously take several days not doing anything, you're going to chew through that stimulus relatively quickly, and you're going to be back where you were when you started or even before that. In contrast, if you do a larger amount of volume, like is habitual in bro splits, sure, you can have several more days before you actually have to, put some more gas back in the tank, basically, before you actually have to do some more hypertrophy stimulating work to get yourself back out of the atrophy that you've generated. So basically, this is a very simple concept, but it's a really important one. It's just trying to show that there is always going to be a growth phase when you're in the stimulus period post-workout, which is typically regarded as 48 hours. Everything outside of that 48-hour window necessarily means that you are losing hypertrophy that you've previously gained, and we're going backwards again. So ideally, what we're trying to do here is minimize the amount of time that we spend inside those atrophy periods, which obviously starts to push us towards a higher frequency kind of concept. But before we do that, let's look at the next slide, which is the maintenance of kind of hypertrophy from week to week, and how much stimulus we actually need in order to stay on maintenance. Awesome. So basically, this slide does exactly what I was just saying. It gives you a very clear picture of how many sets you need to do in a workout in order to get to the following week without losing everything that you've just gained and more. So if we start at the very bottom, if you do a single set once a week, you are not going to be able to achieve long-term hypertrophy because the atrophy effect is going to more than make up for, it's going to overcompensate for the amount of hypertrophy you stimulated. In contrast, if we look at the next line, 2 sets is going to get you very, very close, and 3 sets is pretty much going to nail it exactly. Now, the reason we think 3 sets nails it exactly is because of the maintenance literature itself. Maintenance literature basically gives us some really nice data showing that if you do 3 sets per week or once a week, you can essentially maintain a muscle exactly the same size. Remember, though, this is 3 sets in a single workout. We'll look later on at what happens if you start spacing those sets out across the week. You get a totally different picture because obviously you've got fewer days spent in that atrophy zone that we were just looking at in the previous slide. So this is literally talking about a certain number of sets once per week without doing anything else for the rest of the week. And you can see here, 1 set's not going to cut it, 2 sets is not going to cut it, but it's really close. 3 sets is going to nail it pretty much perfectly. 4 sets is going to actually give you hypertrophy week on week on week on week. Although, honestly, looking at how little it is, I wouldn't really be too excited about that. I don't think it's the optimal way, certainly, of operating. But, theoretically, at least as far as this example is concerned, and we've got some data backing this up, that's what I would expect to see. So basically, maintenance literature gives us the atrophy side of the equation because we know from the previous slide that we just talked about, 3 sets must be giving us a hypertrophy stimulus that equals the atrophy losses. So if we know that 3 sets is giving us the other side of the equation, the stimulus is equal to the loss, then we just look at the number on the chart, which from memory is around about 1.6, and then we just divide that by the number of days that you are in an atrophy period, which is 5 days per week, and you end up with around about 0.32. And so 0.32 arbitrary units, yes, I've written on the slide, 0.32 arbitrary units of hypertrophy is what we're losing every day. So you can now start using these numbers from the workout stimulus model that we talked about last time, and also from the maintenance data that you've got here, to calculate the weekly net stimulus that you are looking at for a given training week. And this is a really, really nice numerical way. It's not super complicated, really nice numerical way of just comparing different training frequencies. And it basically shows you that the more frequently you train, the fewer days of atrophy you're dealing with, and so therefore the better your program. But also, when you start looking at workout volumes, increasing workout volume dramatically doesn't get you very far, because you've got to add a lot of volume to really make a meaningful difference from 1, 2, 3 sets. When you start adding more volume on that, you're really not getting very much for each extra set that you do. So it's really starting to push us towards a much higher kind of frequency way of training, which is essentially where we're going to end up when we talk about some examples later on in this talk. But what I'd like to do now is hand back to Jake and have him show you some examples from the old school lifters, because I think they're really nice a way of corroborating the physiology that we're talking about here.
I just want to hang on this slide for a moment longer. So just in case anyone didn't follow along, you mentioned several times about a 5-day atrophy period over the course of the week. So in case anyone didn't follow that, that's because we have this 2-day stimulus period, give or take. So regardless of how much hypertrophy stimulus was achieved in that 2-day period, there's going to be that 5-day atrophy period in a week, just in case people didn't follow that.
And of course, if you were training more frequently, you would reduce that atrophy period. So if you're training twice a week, you only have 3 atrophy days. If you're training 3 times a week, you only have 1 atrophy day. So these atrophy days do add up at 0.32 units a day. They are negative, obviously, in our equation. So if you're dealing with 5 atrophy days a week, that's around about 1.6 negative off your total weekly net stimulus. If you've only got 3, obviously that's 0.96, something like that, off your weekly net stimulus. And if you've only got 1, it's only minus 3.32. So the fewer days you can manage to kind of structure your program with, the atrophy days, the more successful your program is likely to be.
It's a really interesting concept, isn't it? Because ultimately what it's suggesting is there's 2 main variables here. We're not just looking at the stimulus, but looking at the atrophy. And if we can prevent that atrophy, even if we're not adding a lot to the stimulus, if we're just preventing the atrophy, that actually adds a lot over the course of the week.
It does.
So if you were to, I just want to pull up this first slide for a moment. If you were to look at this and you were to ask yourself, how do we prevent that atrophy period? What kind of split would we be looking at if we wanted to avoid that atrophy period completely? There's really only 2 ways we could do that. Now, as far as the pre-steroid era bodybuilders go, if we were to kind of categorize them, we've got what's called the bronze era. We haven't talked too much about the bronze era guys last week, but that'll be people like George Hackenschmidt, Eugene Sandow. Why I haven't mentioned them much is they were very much that performer, strongman type athlete. Obviously they didn't have the accessibility to equipment that we have today. And so their workouts were quite novel and probably maybe not the most efficient way that you could train today. But if we were to look at those guys briefly, well, we see both Hackenschmidt and Sandow did advocate for daily whole body exercise. Now, what exactly that looked like was a little bit, it varied a little bit. There was a lot of unique exercises that they performed, but they were essentially achieving a stimulus each day for the full body. They were doing 1 set per whatever exercise they were doing. And so essentially they've entirely eliminated that atrophy period. Now, if we move forwards in time to what we would call the silver era, now that spans right up to about 1960. Now, we've talked about anabolics being introduced in that time period, so in the late 50s or mid 50s. So I'm particularly interested in the silver era before 1954. And if we look at what kind of splits they were performing or using in up until that time period, Well, we've got people like Reg Park, Steve Reeves, John Grimek, who we talked about last week, Clancy Ross, who we talked about. I wanted to include a female. We've got Abby Stockton here, who is referred to sometimes as the female version of John Grimek because she had her strength level was so high. And then we've got people like Bob Hoffman at the end. And almost unanimously, these people were advocating for full body 3 times per week. There were very few exceptions where they deviated from that slightly, which I will talk about a little bit later. But very, very across the board, these people were all advocating full body 3 times per week, which is almost that every second day, like that 2-day stimulus period, and then having another hypertrophy stimulus. So if we go back to that slide, I'm not going to pull it up, but if we think about that hypertrophy atrophy period, both the bronze era and the silver era guys were very much training in a way that was preventing almost that entire atrophy period. Now, to give you guys a couple of examples quickly of a few silver era workouts. So here we have, this is actually a Steve Reeves one. And obviously Steve was at that cusp of when anabolics were being introduced. But this was written, he wrote this in a magazine in the early 50s before 1954. And he discussed using this for his Miss America and Mr. Universe titles. And here, I haven't given the exercise selection, but he discussed using 3 different exercises for each muscle, and he did 1 set only, and he did this full body 3 times per week. So if we think back to the hypertrophy stimulus, the first slide we showed recapping last week, and we think back to the recovery stimulus or recovery ratio that we were talking about last week, this very much fits in with all these paradigms so far. One more example I wanted to give of a silver era workout. We talked a little bit about John Grimek last week. I'm going to mention John Grimek again later today, but we touched on this workout plan from last week. And this was one of the first, those challenges, online challenges people do today. This was one of those first challenges. So he did a 90-day transformation challenge, which was a magazine challenge in 1953. And this was his bulking routine that he had people follow. And as we can see, we've got 1, 2, and some muscles have 3 sets that are done 3 times per week. So again, we've almost eliminated that atrophy period completely. And some of these muscles are only getting that 1 set. So in terms of what you've touched on with the hypertrophy stimulus, that 1 set 3 times per week was enough to produce a weekly net stimulus that these guys are seeing hypertrophy. This volume was not distributed over 3 workouts. It certainly was not. This was one workout. But if we look at it, ultimately it's, what's that, about 13 sets, 12 sets. So it's a lot of exercises, but it's not an excessive amount of total work volume of sets. So I'm going to pass back over to you, Chris, and pull up the previous slide, Steve Reeves, that was also over 1 workout, certainly. Okay, so.
Okay, so basically what I'd like to do in these final 2 slides is talk about the comparisons that we're expecting to see between training kind of in one particular way or training in another particular way. I'd like to just start by illustrating how, if you do, at least in the context of this weekly net stimulus model that I've been developing recently, if you do 1 set twice a week, which I know is not exactly the same as what Jake's just been talking about, but even 1 set twice a week, that 1 set twice a week is going to get you to a better place by the end of the week in comparison than just doing 3 sets once a week. So 3 sets once a week is a really nice kind of benchmark number because it gives us our maintenance level. So I'm going to keep coming back to this idea of 3 sets once a week, simply because we know that what you put in is what you then have to take out again by the end of the week. So it just keeps you exactly in the same place. So it's a really nice starting point. But if we look at the graph here, we've got our orange line showing our 3 sets once per week, which zeroes us out by the end of the week. We've got the stimulus period creating the muscle growth, and then obviously we lose all of it by the time we get to the end of the week and we start again. If we look at the blue line, it gives us 2 workouts in the week with a single set. The second curve reaches a higher point because it starts at a higher point, because we're not actually fully atrophied from the previous workout when we start the second workout. So you're actually starting higher, therefore you end up higher on the curve. So basically, when we get to the end of the week, our weekly net stimulus is around about 1.03. If we look obviously at 3 sets once a week, it doesn't get us to that net stimulus effect. We get a 0 net stimulus effect because 3 sets in equals 3 sets out. So this is really, really important. Now, I want to use this moment before we look at the last slide that I've got in the sequence. I just want to use this to talk briefly about what you're going to see in the rest of the fitness industry when they're talking about training frequency. In the rest of the fitness industry at the moment, you're probably going to come across the position that it doesn't matter how many sets per week you do, as long as you kind of do the same number of sets across the week, whether you do all of them on a Monday or whether you apportion them over a Monday or Wednesday and a Friday, you are going to still end up with the same hypertrophy, because weekly volume is the driver of hypertrophy, and that's kind of the position statement. And the frequency literature often does show that. So if you go trawling through the frequency literature, you will find basically that most frequency studies have not found much difference between allocating the same number of sets to a smaller number of workouts or to a larger number of workouts across the week. Okay. There are basically several problems with the literature. The first one is that physiologically it doesn't make any sense. So physiologically, to say that 9 sets on a Monday equals 3 sets 3 times a week, which is about the highest level of volume you're going to see for a high frequency group that works, more on that in a moment. If you do look at the difference between those, then basically the 9 sets once per week has got to deal with 5 days of atrophy, which we know happens. It's a physiological reality. And the 3 sets 3 times a week doesn't. So straight away, you're saying, okay, physiologically, this doesn't make sense. Why would 9 sets on a Monday equal 3 sets 3 times a week when the atrophy periods are different? Okay. Second physiological problem. The second physiological problem you've got is you've got a diminishing returns effect. You can't do 9 sets on a Monday and say that that equals 3 sets 3 times a week, because the diminishing returns effect tells us that's impossible. At least your first set 3 times a week is giving you 1 unit of stimulus straight away, and that's 3+ units of stimulus, and you can only maximum really get up to about 2.2 doing all of your sets on a Monday. So physiologically, again, the actual workout stimulus numbers don't stack, because you can't simply say that 9 sets on a Monday equals 3 sets 3 times a week, because you've got more earlier sets in your high frequency group. So we're starting from a point where we're disbelieving the outcomes of the frequency literature. So we're going to start looking at why there might be a problem. Well, there might be a problem basically because every time we look at the frequency literature, what we find is that, with the exception of maybe 3 studies, and I'm not actually joking here, I literally mean with the exception of like 3 studies, pretty much the entirety of the frequency literature has looked at volumes which are over the thresholds that are recoverable. So when I showed that slide earlier with the relationship between recovery period and number of sets per workout, it gives us a linear line on a graph. And basically you can kind of track it, and you can say, basically, if you're doing 3 sets, you're going to need 2 days to recover, but you can still do a workout every other day. If you do 4 sets or 5 sets, you can't do that. You can't recover in time to do the next workout. You are going to have a suppressed level of stimulus if you try and do that. Yeah, this is the slide. So you can see on this slide, you can absolutely recover from up to about 3 sets on the vertical axis. We track across 3 sets. You can see you're going to recover in 2 days. If you go up to 4, you're looking at, or 4 or 5, you're looking at needing 3 days, which means it's an upper lower, kind of twice a week type arrangement. And if you want to do more than that, 6, 7, 8, you're absolutely going to need to do a bro split where you're only training that muscle group once per week. Now, the issue with that then is that we really are not going to be able to use that frequency literature where the high frequency group is not recovering as a useful source of information. So if we look at a standard frequency study that's comparing 1 day or 2 days with 3 days, and we look at the 3-day-a-week group and we find that they're being required to do 5+ sets per workout, I'm just going to take that study and I'm going to put it on this pile over here, and I'm going to say that's not helpful. because the people in the high frequency group are not recovering in time. Therefore, I'm not expecting them to be capable of demonstrating a good amount of muscle growth by doing those programs. It's just not feasible to compare them with people, who are training once a week and doing 9 sets, 10 sets, whatever, and are highly likely to recover by the following Monday. So ultimately, most of the frequency literature is giving a result which is unexpected, at least based on the physiology I've described. It's giving a result that's unexpected. It's telling us that frequency doesn't matter. Well, the main reason I think it's showing that frequency doesn't matter is because the high frequency groups are not recovering. And they're not recovering because they're doing too many sets, as shown by the slide that we've got on the screen at the moment. So essentially, if we look at the very small number of studies that have actually used recoverable volumes, at least by the metrics on this chart, which are all in strength trained people, there's no untrained data on this chart. So if we look at the data in trained people, and we look at recoverabilities and the periods of time necessary to recover from each number of sets, and we say, okay, we're going to accept A study, B study, C study, because they are actually, programming volumes that we can recover from. At that point, we start to see that higher frequencies are better than lower frequencies for hypertrophy, which is exactly what the physiology would predict. And at that point, we've got an explanation for why the literature is weird. We've got an explanation we've got a finding that we're expecting, which is high frequency is better, and it fits with the physiology that is underpinning that finding. So basically, I think where we end up is that the frequency literature is giving us a very, very unexpected result at the moment. Let me now jump to the... No, actually, I was going to pass back to you, wasn't I, Jake, before we do the final
I'm going to jump back in.
Examples for us. Yeah, do that.
Yeah.
That'd be cool.
I'm going to jump back to that slide you were talking about. So the blue line being 1 set done twice per week. And as you can see at the end of that 7-day period, there should actually be some growth that's occurred just from that 1 set twice per week. So it'll be nice. Let's have a look if anyone actually did that back then. And let me find my slide. I've got a couple of quotes I want to share with you guys. So to bring up John Grimek again, there's a couple of quotes here. So beginners should train 3 times per week, but if they feel tired, which I'm assuming indicating they're not recovering, they should drop down to twice per week. And he goes on to say a good program would be 8 to 10 exercises performed for 1 set each. So presumably 1, maybe 2 sets per muscle. So here he's insinuating 1 set for some muscles twice per week would be enough to produce hypertrophy, which would make sense based on your previous slide. He does suggest that a 3rd session is better where possible. For bodybuilding, prefer to do 1 set of each exercise. Beginners will do fine with 1 exercise for each muscle group, while advanced can perform additional exercises. And here he says most bodybuilders should be able to do 3 times per week. But there is a theme that comes across with a lot of these early guys where if someone's not recovering, they talk about actually reducing how many sessions per week down to 2 as opposed to increasing volume, which tends to be probably the more common thought today, that if someone's a non-responder, you jack up the volume, but it's very much the opposite of what a lot of these guys are actually talking about. So a couple more quotes. This is Period Grader. So this is actually the founder of Iron Man magazine back in, I think, 36. And this is from his book that he released in 1946. So almost a decade before anabolics probably came onto the scene. And this was in the context of a workout that he presented in this book, which consisted of 1 to 4 sets per muscle. And he actually talked about increasing up to 4 sets as like a top end. And some people might actually find they do better and slightly lower volume there. And so he actually says, let's start with 1 set first. And so the quote, he says, we advise the pupil to start with 2 periods, so 2 workouts per week, such as on a Tuesday and Friday. And later on, you may, if you find it desirable, change to 3 per week, so add in a 3rd session. And he does emphasize you should always have 1 or 2 rest days between each workout. So again, we've got another example here of where 1 set done twice per week seemed to be effective, seemed to be something that some of these guys were actually advocating, which would make perfect sense when we go back and look at the physiology you've just explained. Now, before I pass back to you, I actually want to jump back to our British finalists. And actually, just before I even mention this, I'm going to go back to your slide. So during the week, someone messaged me and they said, because you know how you were just explaining taking this data, taking the hypertrophy stimulus, and it's actually a relatively easy equation. I had someone message me during the week and they said they did exactly that. They took the atrophy, hypertrophy stimulus period, they took the hypertrophy stimulus data based on per sets, and they plugged into ChatGPT. And they said to ChatGPT, give me the most efficient training split. And unsurprisingly, ChatGPT came out with doing a full body 3 times per week. So even ChatGPT managed to get it correct. Now, let's go back to our British finalists. So for you guys who weren't here last week, I did talk about this study or this paper last week. And basically what this was published in 1954, and they surveyed all of the finalists for the Mr. Britain from the year prior. And they basically looked at a number of metrics of how many sets they did, how many repetitions they did, what kind of progression model they followed. And they put it all into tables, which is really nice. But they did not include a table for split. And I suspect the reason for that is, as they quote, they said nearly everyone was just following 3 times per week, full body. So they didn't even bother putting a table. So this was all of the Mr. Britain finalists, including Sean Connery, and they were doing full body 3 times per week, much like almost everyone else we've looked at so far. But there was an interesting quote. Now, this is a bit of a sidestep. It's not directly relevant to what we're talking at the moment, but I did find it quite interesting when I saw it. And they said, furthermore, experience has shown that if less than 10 repetition max weight is used habitually, and for considerably more than 10 repetitions and more than 4 or 5 sets are performed on one muscle group, so they're using a lot of reps in reserve and high volume, then not only do the muscles fail to grow, but they may actually become smaller. In the experience of bodybuilders, such a system of high repetition, low resistance exercise, although usually increasing stamina or muscular definition, never substantially increases muscular bulk. So it's interesting they've cottoned on to this idea of high volume, high repetitions, high sets, far away from failure. Reps in reserve doesn't seem to be producing a hypertrophy stimulus, even though there's still people today who are arguing that reps in reserve and 8 reps and whatever else seems to still potentially produce hypertrophy. There's one more quote I want to mention, and then I'm going to pass back to you, Chris, to comment on it. And this was Joe Weider. So Joe, where are we? Here we go. So I've not talked much about Joe. Joe was sort of the, I guess, alternative to Hoffman, who I've mentioned a few times now. And Joe is largely responsible for why we have the split system and growth splits. And I'll touch on that again in a moment after your next slide. But this was an interesting quote from 1956. I know this is likely a year or two after anabolics were introduced, but it's still an interesting quote. And I think it ties in well with that previous quote we just saw about the higher volumes not achieving a hypertrophy stimulus. Now, bear in mind, this is 1956, so some of the language is not exactly correct, and we would use different terminology now. But he says, quote, the uppermost fibers, so let's think about these as lower threshold mode units, are called into play first, and then only with continued muscular activity do the more deeply embedded fibers, let's think higher threshold mode units, or muscle cells, lend a helping hand. So essentially, he's explained Henneman's size principle there. Low threshold, high threshold as effort increases. And he goes on to say, now when you perform high repetitions, you get the upper fibers, which are like the low threshold mode units, to work. And as you keep pounding out repetitions, the ones next in line get to work. That's exactly Henneman's size principle. But long before you can reach those, which he says really deeply embedded, your energy gives out. Not because of actual muscular inability to continue the exercise, but due to body exhaustion. Here, he's essentially explaining maximal tolerable perception of effort, afferent feedback coming from high repetitions, this burning stimulation and this discomfort produced by high reps. And he's saying that this is actually getting in the way of people achieving hypertrophy stimulus and high threshold mode unit activation because of that negative sensation from the high reps. So that coupled with the previous quote, I thought was quite interesting because it's in fairly stark contrast to the general kind of sentiment we would see a lot of the time online today. So I thought I'd set you up with that, Chris, and see what you've got to say to some of that.
Yes, well, I mean, of course, this is the message that, or these two observations are messages that I've been championing for some time now. You know, the physiology literature is very, very clear that if you perform longer duration exercise to task failure with a lower weight, with a lighter resistance, as is the case with 15, 20, 25 rep max sets, you will experience more post-workout fatigue. And that's because the more calcium ion accumulation happens during the workout, the more post-workout muscle damage you create, and therefore the more post-workout fatigue you're going to create. So you can't really compare multiple sets of 15, 20 rep max with multiple sets of 5 rep max. The 5 rep max is going to be so much easier to recover from than the 15 rep maxes. It's not even funny. So then the second issue, the maximum tolerable perception effort, again, the issue that we've got is that light load sets probably don't cause quite so much hypertrophy as heavy load sets. Now, I know that in the literature, the numbers sort of stack pretty much adjacent to each other, and the hypertrophy differences are not sort of significant. But I think over a long enough period of time, the physiology is telling us that if you train with heavier loads, you're probably going to get a little bit more hypertrophy, and it probably will add up over a sufficiently long period. And it's simply for exactly the same reason as explained here, which is that you just can't get the same level of recruitment if you've got sources of discomfort or pain or suffering coming from elsewhere in your body. If you're doing high repetition multi-joint exercise and you're breathing really hard, your effort perceptions include that perception from your cardiovascular system, and that stops you from maxing out the sensation of innervation, which stops you maxing out motor unit recruitment. This is just really basic psychobiological model of fatigue, which I've talked about many, many times before. And it's really nice to see that people instinctively had grasped this concept a very, very long time ago, and expressed it in very, very similar terms with some very minor, kind of issues. I wouldn't use the word energy, and, I wouldn't use the word body exhaustion, but the point is clear. It tells you, pretty much exactly the same thing as the psychobiological model of fatigue. So, terminology issues aside, this is brilliant to see because it shows that, bodybuilders instinctively did grasp exactly how hypertrophy worked, exactly how strength training works for hypertrophy a very long time ago. And basically, it makes the point that we're trying to make with this webinar, which is that, a lot of what is presented today as kind of the wisdom of bodybuilding is really not that wise, because it's been infiltrated and disguised by the use of anabolics to the point where nobody really knows what works anymore. If you go back to the point when people didn't have that problem, then yeah, sure, people had made some really good observations and they figured out pretty much what worked. I don't think we can really rely on today's era of bodybuilders, or even bodybuilders going back to the 60s and beyond, because ultimately this issue of anabolics completely stops us from making useful perceptions and inferences about what's going on.
Your point there that we can't even go back to the 60s and beyond, I actually just want to pick up on that point. But just before I do, there was, in this quote, he continued to say, test it yourself. He said, get a 15 rep max load or something along those lines. And he said, go to failure, rest, go again, and see how you feel with that second set. And he said, give it a few days, do it again, but this time use a 6 repetition max, give it a minute, go again, and see how you perform. And it's like you said, these guys made these observations that the physiology explains today, but it wasn't muddied by anabolics and I guess, other variables that was making it hard to ascertain what did or didn't work, or what did or didn't have what effect. So when did splits actually become utilized? And I want to show you this slide. So there's obviously different types of splits, and this is what I could find as far as when we first get introduced to different split systems. So we have Bob Hoffman, who I've mentioned a few times, and from York Barbell, and he had a leg development course, and the goal here was obviously to bring up the lower body. And bear in mind, Hoffman was more focused on weightlifting than bodybuilding to an extent, and so this was a little bit more focused towards that. But in this plan, he advocated for lower body done twice a week, and then upper body could be done 1 or 2 times per week. So essentially, he's putting upper body on maintenance and then trying to bring up the lower body. So we have an upper lower split here. Now, we'll come back to Reg. I want to actually jump back down to Joe. So if we look at, I've given a couple of examples here from Joe, but if we jump down to the beginner, intermediate, advanced section. So in 1954, he introduced, published a few courses, a few training routines, and he discussed putting beginners on full body 3 times per week, and then progressing that into an upper lower split for intermediates. And then he discussed actually returning to full body for the advanced course, which was focused more on strength. He calls it power, but ultimately they were performing lower repetitions to try to build strength. And he talked about that being key for an advanced person continuing to progress, which ultimately would be their way of talking about accessing new high threshold motor units. He also advocated for specialization courses, and this was very similar to what Reg was publishing as well. So Reg and Joe obviously had a lot to do with each other, and Reg was sort of one of Joe's lifters. And Reg in 1952 put out a Mr. Universe, or a number of Mr. Universe courses, and these included specialization courses. And ultimately, these courses had as the foundation full body 3 times per week, but then you could have a focus muscle, a specialization muscle. And what he advocated to do was actually take that out from the full body session. So let's say you're doing arms, you would take out all arm work in the full body days, and you would perform the arms on their own separate days on alternate days. Now, he did also mention, and actually Joe had basically the exact same method, and both of them talk about that if you can't do alternate days, if you can't do 4, 5, 6 days per week, then instead what you could do is take that focus muscle and move it to the start of your session. So you're changing exercise order. You might add a couple additional exercises, but you're focusing when you've got your freshest, you're most recovered, you're going to use whatever muscle is the focus of that session. So even when we do see the development of splits, we still have high frequency where essentially everything is getting 2, maybe that 3rd day per week. As far as splits as we know them today, I can't find any evidence of anyone following these in the 40s or 50s. As far as one muscle once per week, 10 sets, 12 sets for one muscle, give it 7 days off, I just don't see that. That doesn't seem to be used, from what I can tell, until the 60s. By then, well and truly, anabolics we know are being used. We know at least from 58, 59, they're widespread as far as the anabol goes. So, and Joe was really big at actually pushing forward to split system. And then obviously Arnold came under Joe. And so Arnold, it was all history after that. But as far as a normal growth split, until anabolics are being used, that standard growth split as we know it today just simply did not appear. Now, let's take a look as to perhaps why that might be. That's not the slide.
So what's
is
this? No, it is. It is. It's just that the axis is slightly condensed compared with the previous slide that we looked at. But basically what this slide does is it shows you that if you do a single set twice a week, you are going to come out ahead of somebody who does 8 sets once a week, at least as far as the weekly net stimulus model is concerned. And the simple reason for that is that we lose so much of the muscle growth that we've been stimulating in our 8 sets across the remainder of the week. Now, essentially, this is a really nice slide for me to kind of wrap up everything I've been saying on, because ultimately, if somebody is taking anabolics, then one of the major advantages of taking anabolics is that you don't have that atrophy period, because you're basically constantly in a state of growth. So essentially, you don't have to worry about losing all of that muscle growth that you've achieved in the previous workout, because you basically don't have the atrophy period. And this is really, really important. We don't, I think, talk about this enough. Because what it means is that suddenly bro splits will function pretty well for the average lifter who is using anabolics, because they don't have an atrophy period. Now, is it still optimal? Well, no, because if you look at the size of the stimulus that we get from 1 or 2 sets, you do that a couple of times a week, and you're still going to be at a higher level than somebody who's doing 8, 9, 10 sets once a week, simply because you've got this first set advantage. First sets in a workout always have bigger stimuli than the later sets in the same workout. So if I do 3 sets 3 times a week, which is probably about the maximum amount of volume, certainly that I can do at a high frequency level, and probably a lot of people are quite similar. You're basically looking at about 1.6 units, arbitrary units each workout. 3 times a week, that's 4.8. If you compare that with the maximum amount you can do in a single workout, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, you're still going to be sitting around 2.2, 2.3, 2.4. So you are still half at 50% of what you could do if you just did 3 sets 3 times a week. So ultimately, where I kind of want to wrap up is that higher frequency is always going to be better, whether somebody is using anabolics or not. But anabolics do almost certainly even out the playing field somewhat between bro splits and everything else, because you don't have these gigantic periods of atrophy when you're eliminating most of the benefits that you've got from your last workout. So I think it's not a surprise that the 1960s saw a change in programming from, kind of full body 3 times a week or 2 times a week in certain cases to bro splits. It was facilitated by the use of anabolics, because that's the only way bro splits really make any sense. Now, I know that a lot of people are going to argue with that. I know that a lot of people are going to, think still that bro splits are a good way of training. I'm not here to persuade those people. I'm just here to try and find out a numerical model, really, of predicting what different programs do, and therefore can be compared with each other. So basically, as I say, this shows a very surprising, extreme example of how weekly net stimulus works, and it shows you that even just doing a couple of sets twice a week is going to be, or 1 set in this example twice a week, is actually going to be better than doing a bro split with kind of 8+ sets in a single workout. So that's where I'd like to leave it. Do you have anything else you wanted to say, Jake?
No, that's about it. I just want to talk to one comment, but if people do have questions, now's the time to pop them in the chat. There was a couple of comments talking about some of the volume of some of the workouts I was using as examples, and I just wanted to mention that they weren't all that high volume. So they tended to be the workouts that either people were following, and bearing in mind that these are sort of champions, they would have fairly good genetics. But there are often people talking about what they refer to as abbreviated workouts, which is for people who couldn't recover as well, or perhaps didn't have time, or perhaps had a very labor intensive job. And a lot of those abbreviated workouts, they tended to be about 4 exercises. And so it was kind of like the classic, it would be like a squat, like some kind of row or pull up, a bench. Sometimes I think it was just that. There might be an overhead exercise. And sometimes I would say you can add in a biceps exercise if you feel able. And so there were certainly more abbreviated, tolerable kind of total number of exercises that people were using. So that's about all we had that we wanted to go over. If you guys do have questions, pop them in there. I think just to reiterate what you said, Chris, it's not anything new, but it's a really important point, is if we look at that last slide, ultimately why things get so confusing in the 60s onwards with anabolics is that steep decline in that atrophy period from that growth split. Essentially, you're saying you don't need to be as concerned about that when we include anabolics. And so suddenly that whole puzzle piece of how do you have a hypertrophy stimulus and how do you minimize that atrophy period, while it's not going to change what's most effective, it's going to allow for much larger margin of error that we don't see with naturals. So obviously that very much confuses the topic going forwards after the 60s.
So there's a really, really nice question that's just popped up in the chat, which is, does this change if we're talking about stretch position exercises versus contractor position exercises? Basically, stretch position and contractor position gives the same recovery issues that you have with lighter loads versus heavier loads. So if you're using lighter loads, 15, 20 rep maxes, you are not going to be able to follow the same frequency, kind of programs as somebody who's using heavier loads, at least if you're doing the same number of sets. In fact, if you're doing 15, 20 rep maxes, you're probably not going to be able to do a high frequency program like 3 days a week, because even 1 set to failure with a high repetition range doesn't allow you to recover, at least on average. You may be the exception, but a person generally can't recover in time for a 48-hour window to do another workout, in that period of time. So The same problem applies with stretch position exercises. If you start doing loads of stretch position stuff, it's going to take longer to recover. You've got to ask yourself whether that is, whether the juice is worth the squeeze, whether you're actually going to get a benefit from doing that particular exercise compared to something else. But broadly speaking, if you move towards heavier rep ranges and more contracted position or mid-range exercises, you are going to be able to do more volume than if you do a more stretch position or a lighter load, definitely.
There's one, I just want to speak to one of these comments. Someone had asked, what's considered a muscle group? And people are talking about overlap between different muscles. I want to pull up one of the slides. Here we go. No, that's not the one, the other Grimek one. So I was talking to Borgie this week about these sort of full body workouts. And I think potentially where maybe there's a little bit of nuance is this second quote here from Grimek, where he talks about starting with one exercise for beginners per muscle, and then advanced people can add additional exercises. I think that's a really interesting concept, because obviously if we have a beginner, there'll be some exercises that will adequately stimulate more than one muscle. And so an example would be the bench, which someone has mentioned in the comments. But by the time you start looking at advanced lifters, I think this is maybe where there's this whole concept that full body doesn't work well for advanced. I think maybe it does start to fall over a little bit when we don't have adequate exercise selection that is actually stimulating everything we want it to stimulate. So I find this a really interesting quote from Grimek, where he's saying we potentially need to add a couple of exercises, because now instead of maybe just having a bench, you could have a chest specific exercise. You could have maybe one or two tricep specific exercises where you're getting long head, medial head, lateral head. So it might be that the total number of sets across the workout might expand, because you need additional exercises to actually adequately stimulate the breadth of motor units. So I think that whole question around overlap and how many muscles are getting stimulated by one particular exercise, ultimately it's an experience question, and it changes for beginner, intermediate, and advanced. And if we go back to, I won't pull it up, but if we look at like Steve Reeves' workout where he was doing 3 different exercises per muscle, that's a very advanced lifter. And that's someone who probably does need, maybe at least 2 exercises to adequately stimulate all the motor units in that muscle.
Yeah, absolutely. And it means that you need to know your exercise biomechanics, and you need to know the individuality of the lifter that you're programming for, because some lifters are going to be very triceps dominant in a pressing exercise. You're going to need to know that, because you may be thinking that you're programming an exercise for chest or for delts, and the lifter is merrily, just using their triceps in everything that you throw at them. So this is one of those things that requires, some study, I think.
Yeah, exactly. And Brian's comment is exactly what we were just getting at there as well. Someone's asked, is the data presented in these slides related to heavier loading,
No.
so lower rep range?
It's all moderate. It's all moderate. So it's all 6 to 15. So if I included either light loads, which is kind of 16 rep plus, or heavy loads, which is 1 to 5 rep maxes, you would get a totally different picture, because the heavier loads would immediately become so easy to recover from. The high rep stuff will be impossible to recover from. The data is all moderate load, sort of 6 to 15. So yeah, if you start using heavier loads, if you start training like Paul and I do in the 4 to 6 rep zone quite a lot, then you're going to find that you can squeak out an extra set here and there, absolutely. But then again, things will depend on other factors. I mean, Paul and I still probably don't squeak out the extra set because we're old, and we prefer to kind of just give ourselves a little bit more recovery time. So it's very, very kind of individual, not very, very individual, but it has individual characteristics to it. But yes, all of it is moderate. All of it is moderate loads.
Someone's
So
asked
there's a
about
question
hacking.
about, I was going to say there's a question about regional hypertrophy, which just relates to what we were already talking about. So I was just going to very quickly just add, yes, regional hypertrophy is just another level on top of the issue we were talking about a moment ago, which is that if you're talking about muscle groups and you're trying to make sure you're training, all all muscles within a group, regional hypertrophy is the same concept. It's just another level down. So if you are a very advanced lifter and you're worried that maybe not every area of a muscle is being trained, you're just going to need to look at the moment-on data, the muscle activation data, and see whether you can see whether one particular exercise will hit one region of a muscle more than another. Good examples of this, if you've got a two-joint muscle, like the hamstrings or the rec fem, or the gastroc or the biceps or triceps or whatever, triceps long head, then generally speaking, they do display very, very regional activation, with the upper region working when the more proximal joint is being loaded, and the distal joint being worked the distal region being worked when the more distal joint is being loaded. So you can absolutely train different parts of those muscles very, very easily. And there are other muscles in the body that do the same thing. The lats have very, very distinct regions, upper, middle, and lower, and you can train those with different planes of motion, for example. But yeah, same concept as what we were talking about. It's just another level of detail.
An extension from that answer, Chris, there's a question here about, say you were to perform, in this question they've said 8 exercises for different muscles. I'm assuming you mean for the same muscle. I'm going to take it to mean that because I think this is an interesting idea. So would recovery differ if you were performing one set of multiple different exercises for the same muscle compared to the same amount of sets, but just for one exercise?
That's
actually, maybe
really,
just before you answer
really,
that,
really
maybe a
good question.
second part of that, if it's okay, would be, so in that example of multiple exercises, say 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 exercises, is it even possible to do that many different exercises for a muscle that's actually going to stimulate different muscle fibers?
That's the easier of the two questions. The answer for that is definitely no. Well, as far as we know, the answer is definitely no, because we generally don't see that much segmentation. I think maybe in the next kind of decade or two, we might start to see a level of detail on some of the larger muscles, more complex muscles, like, for example, the glutes. Maybe there are sufficient segmentations in those muscles that you could potentially get some activation that is very regional across a very wide range of exercises. But as far as we know at the moment, you probably can't do more than about 3 or 4, I would say, for most major muscle groups, and still hit different regions. In terms of the first question, let's say we've got 4 regions and we're doing 2 sets per exercise, and we're doing 8 sets, something like that, compared with 8 sets of the same exercise. The answer to this question is actually not simple. And the reason for that is because if you look at I'm just going to go off on a bit of a kind of a physiology sort of rabbit hole for a moment. If you look at the electrically stimulated data, which is where we are maxing out motor unit recruitment in a specific motor unit pool, so a region of the muscle or a muscle within a group. If you repeatedly stimulate that muscle for a long period of time, fatigue doesn't actually go linearly the way that I showed you in the chart earlier. It doesn't do that. It actually goes exponential. So if you activate a fatigue muscle with electrical stimulation, so you're bypassing CNS fatigue filter, which is what we use to protect our muscles. If you bypass that filtering process, you will actually end up with more fatigue than more post-workout muscle damage than you would do if you hadn't, if you trained with fewer sets, and it goes exponentially. So there's an increasing amount of fatigue with the same activation. On the other hand, if you have that CNS fatigue filter in place, you tend to get the more linear kind of response, which is what we see obviously in humans, because we don't tend to do electrical stimulation studies in humans very often. So, but on the other hand, there is this kind of expectation that if you continue doing lots and lots of sets in a workout, you should start to see a bit of a plateauing effect of the post-workout muscle damage because of the accrued CNS fatigue that you're getting. So basically, the answer to the question is really, really difficult, because on the one hand, we have a factor which is driving us towards creating extra fatigue if we just continue battering the same muscle group. So based on the electrically stimulated data, we would say, absolutely, if I just train one muscle region continuously, bang, 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 repeatedly with 8 sets, I should end up with quite a lot of muscle damage that's really quite difficult to deal with. In contrast with doing 4 or 8 exercises that are all training different regions and spreading that fatigue out across a wider area. So initially, physiologically, we would say potentially there is this possibility that training the same region is actually going to be more muscle damage. But the issue is that if you train a large amount of area for a muscle, then potentially you could get just in total more muscle damage just spread out across a larger area. That potentially could then cause more post-workout CNS fatigue, because CNS fatigue depends on just the sheer amount of inflammation that is leaking out into the bloodstream. So the answer is not simple. On the one hand, I'm leaning towards saying, yes, there's a muscle damaging effect that is greater if you just hammer the same region. But on the other hand, I'm looking across the whole body and I'm saying, maybe if we train multiple regions with multiple exercises, I'm likely to see a more kind of CNS fatiguing effect due to the inflammation I'm seeing. So I can't give an answer which is definitive on this, because I can see physiology pushing in multiple different directions at the same time.
Based on that answer, you would assume if you were keeping volume to the level that muscle damage shouldn't be excessive, then spreading it out across multiple exercises.
I'm seeing physiology pushing in multiple directions here, so I'm not comfortable giving a definitive answer. I'm wanting to explain exactly why I think what I think, rather than just kind of being a talking head and giving an answer. I want to show you guys why I think what I think, and that's the answer I'm going to give, because I can't give a more definitive answer, because I can't see a way of actually being specific in this particular instance. It's a really, really, really cool question. That's going to keep me up at night.
There was a quote from John Grimek, and he said that he would prefer, I'm paraphrasing here, but essentially he would prefer to do 10 different exercises for muscle and do 1 set of each, and that you would get 5 of your results in doing 10 sets of 1 exercise for that same muscle. Now, as you've mentioned, 10 is a stretch. You're not going to be able to actually do anything significantly different with 10, but that general idea is an interesting one. Do you want to take any more questions? I know we've exceeded our hour.
We have. It's interesting that we're seeing people commenting in the chat to corroborate my supposition that we would see more CNS fatigue with multiple exercises. That's interesting to see that corroborated, actually. Okay, so I guess that's a really nice question to finish on. Are we doing any more webinars in the future, Jake? We've actually talked about this very briefly, and we said we've really enjoyed doing this and we would be delighted to do it again, but we need a really good topic to grab hold of and do, I think. So if you guys have any ideas and suggestions about what you would like us to cover, then we will put our heads together and see if we can come up with something worth doing. So yes, we've had a great time. I hope you guys have had a great time as well. So please do shoot us some ideas.
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah, if there's good topics, then absolutely we'll do it. A few people asking, do you have any new books in the works or anything along those lines that they can continue to get information from you?
Yeah, so Paul and I are desperately trying to finish our second exercises book, which we're really excited about because it has some really good details on muscle damage per muscle. So it talks about how muscles are different. It talks about how exercises for each muscle are different and how recoverability will therefore be affected. It's designed to couple with the book we released last year for beginners. It's an advanced book. So we're really excited to get that one on the market. We've just had such a horrible month in doing different things. Paul's obviously been, moving house. I've been sick. I've had stuff on. So it's been really crazy, but we're really trying to push that through at the moment. So excited to get that done. Once we've done that, we'll be trying to bring more of the weekly net stimulus model to you guys. We haven't decided what format that will take. so we'll announce anything that we can announce as soon as that is done. But yeah, we're working on getting that book out, and we'll do that as soon as we can.
And obviously, in case anyone's not aware, you've got a podcast that you do generally every 2 weeks where you discuss usually a different physiology topic. So I definitely recommend people check that out. And like I mentioned last week, I've got a WhatsApp group, which is like more education based in terms of sort of shorter snippets of content. There's training templates and stuff like that in there. And Chris will be joining me in writing a guest post each week. So there will be a post on this topic coming in next week's educational topics. So all the info for that kind of stuff is on my bio if you guys are interested. And then I assume you have your podcast and info like that in your bio, maybe?
Everything that I do is linked in my bio. Yeah, so the podcast is in the bio. This webinar was in fact linked in my bio. Everything that all my books, everything like that is all linked in my bios on Twitter and Instagram. I just wanted to mention, because you probably won't do this, but in the groups that you run, your training groups, you are actually have used, and I think are currently using, correct me if I'm wrong, some of these very some routines which are very similar to the routines you talked about in this webinar, with the kind of single set with lots of different exercises. So I've been really excited to see how you've been developing that. Obviously, we talk about that relatively regularly, so it's really nice to see how you've been drawing inspiration and combining it with the physiology to produce some really cool routines in your groups.
Yeah. So that's a Train Hero group for anyone who's interested. And like you said, at the moment, we're doing a single set system. So full body 3 times per week, which anecdotally, this is the second phase we've done this so far. And it's been really interesting to see how people respond to it. The level of, I guess, just general progressive overload with a single set is far greater than anything I've ever seen. I assume there's a huge motivational aspect to that. How long that can continue, whether that's indefinite, is questionable. But if anyone's never tried a single set system before, it's very interesting. So if you do want more info about that, check my bio. Otherwise, I think we're just waffling at this point. So thank you guys for joining in. We appreciate that. And like I said, we'll email over a recording of last session if you guys missed it. And if you have any good ideas for topics in the future and you want us to do this, let us know.
Fantastic. Thanks for hosting this, Jake. It's been great fun. Thank you.
Pleasure.